Blessing still remembers the way the early morning sunlight would spill through the windows of their modest home, casting a golden glow over her mother's well-worn Bible. Her parents, devout Catholics, started every day with prayer, and their unwavering faith shaped Blessing's childhood. To her, church was more than a building, it was home. Her family's routine revolved around their faith. Weekdays were filled with evening devotions, while Sundays were a flurry of activity, ironing crisp outfits, preparing offerings, and walking as a family to their parish. By the time Blessing was old enough to take on responsibilities in the church, she had already memorized most of the hymns and could recite the prayers effortlessly. It was no surprise when she decided to become an altar assistant. "I wanted to serve God in every way I could," Blessing said years later. "It felt right, like it was my purpose." As an altar assistant, Blessing poured her heart into her role. She wasn't just a participant, she became a leader. She taught younger children how to prepare for Sunday Mass, led rehearsals for church processions, and even handled the sacred vestments. The church, for her, wasn't just a duty, it was a calling. But there were sacrifices. Being a teenager with such responsibilities meant missing out on outings with friends and saying no to casual hangouts after school. At times, her peers teased her for being too holy, but Blessing didn't mind. She saw her role as something bigger than herself. "When you're serving God, everything else feels small," she often reminded herself. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed. Reverend Father Michael, the parish priest, frequently praised her efforts during sermons. He called her a shining example for the youth, and her parents beamed with pride. The admiration from the congregation only solidified her resolve to stay committed. Yet, under the surface of this seemingly perfect devotion, Blessing began noticing subtle changes in her world, little things that didn't feel quite right. A lingering glance here, an awkward moment there. At first, she dismissed these feelings as overthinking. After all, the church was her safe haven. It wasn't until later that she would understand how quickly trust could be shaken, and how even the strongest faith could be tested in ways she never imagined. It began like any other day of service at the church. The familiar scent of burning candles and the gentle hum of choir practice filled the air. Blessing, eager to fulfill her duties, responded immediately when the Reverend Father asked for help with cleaning his quarters. To her, it was an honor to assist him, a figure she had admired for his wisdom and guidance. "Blessing, could you help me with this?" "It won't take long," he had said, his voice kind and reassuring. Without hesitation, she agreed. After all, who wouldn't? The church was her second home, and she trusted everyone in it. The first few times she helped, everything was as expected, simple tasks like tidying the bookshelves, arranging files, or sweeping the floor. She even found herself smiling as she worked, thinking of how proud her parents would be if they knew she was helping the church in such a personal way. But as the weeks went on, something began to feel different. She couldn't pinpoint what it was at first. It was in the way he lingered when he spoke to her, the casual compliments that felt a little too personal. "You're such a bright girl," he'd say. "Your parents must be proud." The words seemed harmless, but they stayed with her, leaving her uneasy. Once, when she came to his quarters, the way he looked at her gave her pause. It wasn't like before. The warmth in his eyes felt intrusive, almost as if she were being studied. Still, she brushed it off, convincing herself that it was her imagination. It was only later that she realized her trust had been misplaced, and the foundation of her world, a foundation built on faith, began to crack. Blessing had always considered the church her second home, a sacred space where she could find peace and purpose. But that comfort was starting to unravel. One afternoon, as she scrubbed the Reverend Father's desk, he stood closer than usual. His casual remarks about her hard work, her neatness, began to feel heavier, more personal. Something about his tone made her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to smile politely. "Thank you, Father," she replied softly, hoping her unease wasn't visible. Later, sitting on her bed at home, Blessing replayed the moment in her head. Was she imagining things? Was it just her mind reading too much into a kind word? The thoughts spiraled. She didn't want to doubt a man of God, someone who had guided her family's faith for years. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next Saturday, she hesitated before heading to the church. Normally, she looked forward to her duties, but this time, her feet felt heavy. Her best friend, Ada, noticed her unease. "Blessing, what's wrong? You've been so quiet," Ada asked, leaning closer during their walk to church. Blessing hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing. I think I'm just tired." Ada shrugged it off, but Blessing's heart raced as they approached the Reverend Father's quarters. That day, she couldn't focus on cleaning, her hands trembling slightly as she rearranged items on the shelf. The Reverend's presence felt overwhelming, even though he didn't say much. When she left, she breathed a sigh of relief but knew deep down she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling any longer. Something was changing, and she didn't know how to make sense of it, or who to trust with her fears. Blessing had always trusted the church as a safe space, a place where she felt protected. But on that fateful day, as she watched her friend slump into an unexpected sleep, her world began to unravel. The day had started like any other. She and her friend were asked to help clean the Reverend Father's quarters. Laughing and chatting as they worked, they didn't suspect anything unusual. "You've both worked so hard," the Reverend said, handing them cold drinks. Blessing hesitated. The bottle in her hand was still too cold to sip, so she placed it on the table. Her friend, thirstier and less cautious, drank hers right away. Moments later, her friend began to slur her words. "I feel so tired," she murmured before collapsing onto the chair. Blessing froze, her heart pounding. She shook her friend gently, calling her name, but there was no response beyond a faint murmur. Fear consumed her. What if something serious was wrong? She glanced at the Reverend, whose demeanor remained calm, almost indifferent. A chilling thought crept into her mind: had the drink been tampered with? Praying silently, Blessing stayed by her friend's side until she finally stirred awake hours later. "What happened?" her friend asked groggily. Blessing didn't know how to answer. "You fell asleep," she replied softly, masking the turmoil in her heart. That night, as she lay in bed, Blessing replayed the incident over and over in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The trust she had placed in the Reverend was now shrouded in doubt. That moment marked a turning point. It was no longer about fear, it was about protecting herself and those around her, even if it meant standing up against someone the whole community revered. The weight of silence was unbearable. Blessing had spent weeks replaying the events in her mind, questioning if anyone would believe her. The Reverend was loved by the congregation, seen as a symbol of faith and humility. But the truth weighed heavier than her fears, and she couldn't carry it alone anymore. On a quiet afternoon, she approached the senior priest, heart pounding in her chest. "Father, I need to talk to you." "It's important," she said, her voice trembling. He noticed her unease and gently guided her into his office, shutting the door behind them. "Tell me, child," he said, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. The words came out haltingly at first, but once she started, Blessing couldn't stop. She poured out the details, every moment she had buried deep, every instance that had left her feeling scared and confused. Tears welled up as she spoke, her voice breaking under the weight of her story. The senior priest listened in silence, his face a storm of emotions, shock, sadness, and disbelief. "Have you told anyone else? Your parents?" he finally asked. Blessing shook her head. She couldn't bring herself to burden her family. "You've done the right thing by coming to me," he assured her, but she couldn't tell if his words brought relief or more fear. What would happen next? Would anyone believe her? That night, as she lay in bed, her mind raced with doubts. She had broken the silence, but the uncertainty of the road ahead was terrifying. Yet, for the first time in weeks, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Someone knew her truth now, and that was a start. The truth doesn't always set you free, it sometimes chains you to an uphill battle. That's how Blessing felt as she stepped into the dimly lit room where the church council gathered. She sat before a long wooden table, facing the skeptical eyes of men who had served the church for decades. This wasn't the safe space she had imagined when she decided to tell her story. The questioning began. They wanted every detail, the who, the what, the when, the why. Blessing struggled to explain moments that still made her skin crawl. Her hand shook as she described the discomfort, the fear, and the sense of betrayal she felt. But instead of sympathy, she was met with silence. Across the room, the Reverend Father sat, his expression calm, almost serene. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was firm but gentle. He didn't attack her outright. Instead, he painted a different picture, Blessing as a confused young girl with a vivid imagination. "It's unfortunate," he said, shaking his head, "but I believe she misunderstood my intentions." To make matters worse, he presented a video showing Blessing cleaning his quarters, flanked by two friends. It seemed innocent enough, too innocent. Why would someone in danger return repeatedly? A council member asked her. Blessing's throat tightened. She wanted to scream that appearances weren't everything, that fear and manipulation could silence even the strongest person. Instead, she looked at her lap, tears threatening to spill. She left that day feeling small, as if her voice was too faint to compete with the power and reputation of a man like him. But the recording her friend had unknowingly made would soon bring light to the darkness, and she would find her courage again. Blessing had begun to lose hope. The investigation felt one-sided, and the weight of public opinion was crushing her spirit. Many people she had known all her life now looked at her with doubt, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Every Sunday at church became a trial, with glances that felt like accusations. Just when she thought she couldn't endure any more, her phone rang one evening. It was her close friend, the one person who had stood by her side. "I have something you need to hear," her friend said, her voice trembling with urgency. As Blessing listened to the recording, her hand shook. It was a conversation, one she vaguely remembered, where the Reverend had tried to intimidate her into silence. His words, once haunting, were now a lifeline. The proof was undeniable. The weight that had suffocated her for months began to lift, replaced by a small, flickering hope. The next day, Blessing met with the senior priest and handed over the recording. He listened carefully, his expression shifting from shock to quiet resolve. "This changes everything," he told her. When the council reconvened, Blessing sat at the back of the room, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of justice. The recording was played, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Silence hung heavy as the council members exchanged glances. Finally, someone spoke. "The truth has spoken for itself." Tears welled in Blessing's eyes, not out of joy, but from a release of the tension she had carried for so long. For the first time, she felt heard. It wasn't just about proving her story, it was about reclaiming her dignity in a place where she had once felt safe. "Why would anyone believe me?" Blessing thought as she walked home from the council meeting. The weight of judgment pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible burden. Even though the truth was out, and the Reverend Father had been removed, it didn't feel like a victory. For weeks, she avoided looking at the faces of the church members. Their whispers followed her like shadows. "She's the girl who brought him down," some murmured. Others went as far as blaming her for the Reverend's ailing mother, whose health had deteriorated after the scandal. Each word was like a knife, cutting deeper into Blessing's sense of worth. Despite her fear, Blessing kept replaying the moment she stood in front of the council, trembling but determined. "This isn't just about me," she had told them. "This is about ensuring no one else goes through what I did." She had hoped that speaking her truth would bring peace, but the aftermath felt like anything but peace. At home, her parents tried to shield her from the noise. Her mother held her hands one evening and said, "Blessing, sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing. People might not understand now, but you didn't stand for yourself alone, you stood for others too." Those words gave her some comfort, but the isolation was overwhelming. Once an active and joyful member of her church, she now felt like a stranger. The place that once felt sacred now seemed heavy with unspoken accusations. Still, in her heart, she knew she couldn't let the opinions of others define her. "Maybe I'll find a way to heal," she whispered to herself one evening. "Maybe not today, but someday." And with that thought, she began the slow process of rebuilding her faith, in herself and in her future. Blessing didn't expect that her greatest test of faith would come from the very place she had always considered safe. For months after the ordeal, she struggled to reconcile her love for the church with the pain she had endured within its walls. The same pews where she once knelt to pray now felt like a battleground of whispers and judgmental glances. It wasn't just the stares that hurt, it was the silence of those she had considered family. Friends she had grown up with avoided her, unsure of what to say. The people who had once praised her devotion now whispered rumors as she walked by. What if they're right, she sometimes wondered late at night. What if it would have been easier to just stay silent? But Blessing wasn't built to crumble. Though she stepped away from her roles in the church, she didn't abandon her faith entirely. Every Sunday, she walked into the church with her head held high, her presence a quiet defiance against those who doubted her. It was her mother who reminded her of the strength she had shown. "God doesn't let us walk through fire for nothing," she told Blessing one evening, sitting beside her on the porch. "You were brave enough to speak up, even when the world wanted you to stay quiet. Don't let them steal your light." Those words became a balm for her soul. Slowly, Blessing began to heal, not through forgetting, but through remembering her worth. She forgave herself for the moments she doubted her strength and prayed for the courage to find joy again. Though she no longer served at the altar, her faith remained unshaken. It wasn't the building that defined her belief, it was the quiet, unyielding connection to the God who had never left her side.